As you said, my name is Margo Thomas. I, by way of introduction, I'm currently the founder and president of the Women's Economic Imperative, which is a global nonprofit that has been established to contribute to efforts at increasing economic equity, particularly for women. And we see our mission in a way as catalyzing and advancing women's economic empowerment more specifically. I hope to share with you a little bit more about how we try to do that.
So, Margot, in the past several months, I've been really looking at this idea of empowerment and marginalized communities. But starting, I don't think of women as marginalized, but I think of them as there's an opportunity in the boardroom, in leadership positions, in all the way up and down the food chain, if you will, of work. And all of those conversations kind of have been at a local level. Someone I'm talking to is dealing with someone locally. You, on the other hand, are sitting at the literally at the United Nations level. Tell us a bit of, I'd like to just go back a little bit, how you got to that level in the first place.
Okay. And yes, and so I don't currently sit at the United Nations level. I That was something I had the privilege of doing a couple of years ago. So in terms of my trajectory, I really started out as an advisor and an economic advisor, specifically around foreign investment and economic growth, private sector development in the World Bank Group. Um, and I like to say to people that I point out very clearly, I'm not a gender expert. I'm a policy expert
Mm.
in those areas that I have outlined. Spent most of my career in the bank, 30 years and a little bit more, providing policy advice to governments around the world. I've had the privilege of working in just about every region or corner of the earth, broadly speaking. And in that capacity, I've advised roughly 50 national and subnational governments on the issues of private sector development and economic growth. I backed into gender because towards the end of my term in the World Bank, we were looking at how we address some of the slow growth our clients were encountering. And at the time, I was working in the Balkans, living in the Balkans, and really trying to look at where it is we can get an additional push. And so that work led to a focus on women's economic contribution. Not that I was the first person to do it. And as I said, I'm not a gender expert, but from a policy and advisory perspective, I felt that I could try to do more. It's because of that work that when Ban Ki moon, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, established his high level panel on women's economic empowerment, um, and they needed someone to lead the secretariat supporting that high level panel. And so in 2015, that's when or 2016, sorry, I was appointed as chief of the secretariat to support that work. So the foundational work on and the shaping of my career really rests on looking at economic growth, particularly in the global south. Um,
Can
and
you
so
help our audience give us an example of a policy mandate that would support that goal?
would support the goal of women's economic empowerment.
Sure, an example of a policy.
Okay, so those policies can take they cut across a number of different issues, but an example would be policies aimed at making the business enabling environment more conducive and supportive of women as entrepreneurs in that space. So, if you have a legal and regulatory framework that somehow or other affects women or underrepresented groups or others, their ability to establish, grow, and operate and scale businesses, that's a policy direction where corrections need to be made. Looking at the regulatory framework, looking at the governing laws and how they impact different groups within an economy, including women, is a very specific kind of policy intervention. So, to go a little deeper with that example, in the French Code, a number of countries in the global south are former colonies, or some are still colonies, of France. And very similar to the British colonial system, there are laws that go back hundreds of years that constrain a woman's ability within society and within an economy to engage in certain actions.
Mm,
So, for example, there may be laws that require a woman to have permission of a father, a spouse,
mm,
but a
mm,
male in the household to get a passport to open a business. And those are specific interventions that are needed. And surprisingly, many of those constraints continue to exist today. On another level, looking at the advanced economies, there are structural constraints. So you may have noticed that the current administration, in taking policy measures to stimulate the American economy in response to the pandemic and the economic impacts, they've been carving out resources and trying to change the structures and operations and policies in order to support women, married and unmarried, who are in the workforce or who are entrepreneurs, but because of the pandemic, have had to either leave the job force in order to take care of family and home, or women who have had to change careers, or women who have simply been demolished in terms of their savings and their economic engagement. So to bring it home, in the context of the USA today, this is a very real issue, and the economy has shrunk because of the pandemic, but women have been disproportionately impacted. So in December of 2020, 140,000 women of color, or Black women, Black American women, left the workforce in the month of December.
mm.
We've been hearing about the Great Migration,
Yeah, we have.
or the Great Resignation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. But that phenomenon has affected primarily women and girls within the economic space.
So that's a lot to chew on because I know that it's very difficult to fight the pandemic. And
Well, yeah.
even with the best policies, there's the reality of life around us. So I'm curious. You've been doing this for so many years. Is there something that encourages you that we're on the right track?
I would I tend to look at life, and that's my personal and guiding principles. I look at issues as a glass half full rather than a glass half empty. So that in itself, I think, communicates the fact that I see that as human beings, there is hope, and we have the capacity working together to try to address these problems. That is what encourages me. I think, however, globally, in the global north and in the global south, we're at an inflection point
Mm.
in terms of how humanity views and responds to each other.
Mm.
The United Nations, I think, after the Second World War, so I don't know the exact year, actually passed a measure that's considered a basic article. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to quote it to you um, correctly. But the essence of it is that we as human beings must recognize the dignity and rights of every other human being. Where we stand today, that very basic, we would think, principle is increasingly being challenged.
Mm.
So for me, we're we're facing health, economic, political challenges, but I do want to use every platform that I have available to me to ask that as human beings, each and every one of us reflect on and recommit to that. Because until and unless we are able to do that, the problems, the shocks, economic, environmental, health, we will never be able to resolve them. That's one. As the second point I would make to that is that as painful and as impactful negatively that the pandemic has been, I think it is forcing us to recognize and understand why we need to value each and every human being. And to recognize, to re-establish the calculus that insofar as I do not ensure that the weakest member of humanity is not in good stead or in good standing, I personally, regardless of whether or not I'm a trillionaire or I'm a poor person, whether I'm at the top of my social class or at the bottom, I cannot survive. I think that's one of the true lessons of the pandemic. We need to get back to those fundamental principles before we can begin to address the issues of the economy and the environmental issues that we're going to be continually facing. So it's this principle of mutual vulnerabilities that I think we all need to take a look at, and then we can start to, again, better understand why, for example, women, as half of the world's population, unless they're afforded rights to which they're entitled as human beings, unless they're protected from violence, that we all suffer as a result. But the suffering and the negative impact will not only affect our generation, it will affect generations to come. In the current political environment, I think this is what we really, all over the world, need to begin to focus on.
Dr. Thomas, I am I am so glad that you are paying attention to this, because I know you have gathered a lot of people around you and you have a very strong voice and a strong point of view. So I appreciate hearing these things from you.
Thank you very much. And I hope we can get into some things a little bit more.